me lovelies, and welcome back to You Don't Have to Be Evil to Work Here, but It Helps, and this time it's Chapter 2. I always complete audiobooks, and I serialise them every other day at 7 o'clock GMT. If you don't want to miss any of these chapters, hit that notifications bell, follow the channel, subscribe, share. Everything you do to interact with the channel really helps me out and lets me know it's all worth it. So, let's get after it. Chapter 2. Assessments, Peter Melsnick wailed. Bloody assessments! We never had anything like that before. Connie Schwartz Alberic shrugged. Lucky, weren't we? Makes you realise how soft we've had it up until now. Never felt like it at the time, of course. The pale-faced girl sniffed. When I was at UMG, for 2 pings, Peter continued, I'd go straight up to Tanner's office and tell him where he can stick his job. I've been in this business 7 years and I've never had to put up with this kind of shit before. What about the other bloody stupid idea? Ongoing vocational training. Like I need some snot-nosed academic telling me how to do what I do. Connie, who'd been in the trade for 5 times 7 years and seen a dozen Peter Melsnicks come and go like flowers in spring, decided not to comment on that. It's modern management theory, she sighed. The stuff they teach you at business school and so on. It's just a fashion. Some more bloody stupid hoops to jump through. That's all. Did I ever tell you about when I was at the San Francisco office and some pinhead decided we needed a company song? What I'd like to know, Benny Shumway interrupted, is who's going to be doing these assessments. Good point, Connie said. Anybody heard anything about that? Nobody had, apparently, but the thin-faced girl mentioned that she'd heard somewhere that Messrs. Tanner and Suslovich, and even Mr. Wells himself, were going to have to submit to the same procedure. Connie looked sharply sideways at her, but nobody said anything. Can you remember how it went? Benny broke the silence. How what went? The company song. Oh, that. Connie grinned. Never came to anything. I believe the pinhead sent a memo to Humph Wells, who pointed out that we'd had a company song since 1877, but you needed to be an operatic baritone to get through it without choking to death. It sort of fizzled out after that. But we'd had a whole month of doing physical jerks on the roof every morning until the pinhead turned his ankle over, which sort of proves my point, she went on. They come up with these stupid ideas, you go along with them for a bit until they self-destruct, and then you can get back to doing things properly, like you've always done them. No harm done. Everyone's happy, and we remain defiantly unspoilt by progress. Benny finished his coffee. Where's young Cassie, by the way? He asked. Not stuck again, is she? No, Connie smiled indulgently. In a meeting with clients, some potty little job south of the river, but I think she's milking it for something to put on her timesheet. Peter scowled. That's another thing I'm really not happy about, he said. These bloody timesheets. I don't like being treated like I'm some wet behind-the-ears trainee straight out of college. If the job gets done and the client's happy and we get paid, what the hell does it matter how many 6-minute units you took writing a letter? We all had to do timesheets at UMG, the pale-faced girl said. Of course, it was complete shambles at the Munich office, given the sort of work what we were doing, but it kept the management happy. A brief who let her in here moment, then Benny thanked Connie for the coffee and left, triggering a general evacuation. It was nearly time for Benny to go to the bank, but, as usual, he wasn't in any hurry to carry out that particular chore. Instead, he went quietly down to the basement and fed the goats. He'd raised an interesting point over coffee, he thought, as he weighed out the barley, oats and concentrates, though he said so himself. If they were going to have assessments, someone would have to do the assessing, and if the pale-faced girl, what was she called? He was usually good with names, but hers slipped through his mind like car keys through a frayed pocket, was right about the partners having them too. Presumably it'd be the new owners, or their trusted representatives asking the questions. Unless they had in mind some setup with one-way glass and microphones, it'd mean coming face to face with them at last. And if he was given that opportunity, he had a trick or two of his own up his sleeve, which might help him find answers to the questions that had been bugging him for the last 3 months. Benny emptied the feed bucket into the trough, gave Esmeralda her apple, and paused, frowning. There was always the direct approach, he reflected. He could always go to Jack Wells or Dennis Tanner and ask them straight out. After everything he'd done for JWW over the years, they owed him that. The thing was, did he really want to know the answer? To the bank. A wretched business as ever, and when he got back to his office and closed the door behind him, he dropped into his chair and sat still and quiet for a while, until he discovered his usual equanimity. Maybe I'm getting too old for this, he thought. Maybe it's time I thought about packing it in. Retirement. All the things he'd claimed to have been daydreaming about all these years. A nice little bungalow somewhere on the south coast. A small open-cast mine of his own, just to keep his hand in. Time for hobbies and gardening and stuff. He shuddered. Thoughts like that helped put going to the bank in context. His door opened, and one of the more appealing aspects of working at JWW these days appeared in the doorway. He found himself smiling. "Hi, Cassie," he said. "Are you busy?" "Not really. Just been and gone and done the banking. I was just about to get a cup of coffee. Can I make you one while I'm there?" Cassie shook her head with extreme vigour. "Thanks," she said, "but no thanks. Never touch the stuff." "Coffee?" She nodded. "Brings me out in blotches, and it's not the caffeine, because I can drink enough tea to kill a whale and be none the worse for it. Funny, but there it is." "All right," Benny said, with a shrug. "No coffee. Tea instead. Won't be a tick." He opened a drawer of his desk, took out 2 empty mugs and gave them a ferocious look, as though they'd betrayed him unforgivably. Immediately they filled with brown liquid and began to steam, and he handed one to her. "Now then," he said, "what can I do for you?" 5 failed marriages, 7 disastrous long-term relationships, and that was only counting the times he'd actually managed to get the girl in the end, albeit temporarily. By now he ought to be completely immune to nice-looking faces, even ones with red hair and freckles. But that was like saying you don't get colds or the flu anymore when you're dead. "It's these stupid reconciliation figures," Cassie said, dropping into the chair opposite and dumping a sheaf of papers on the desk. "I can't make them come out, but I know the numbers are right because I checked them all 3 times against the file, so it must just be some stupid slip-up in the arithmetic or something." Benny grinned. "Give them here," he said. "I'll go through them this afternoon. I've got time before I cash up." "Thanks." "You'll owe me, mind, and I always collect on favours owed." Cassie scowled at him, mock ferocious. "I don't do ironing," she said. "Not for anybody." "It shows. Now me, I'm an absolute bloody virtuoso. Give me a flat surface and a late model Rowenta and basically the sky's the limit." She smiled, but her mind was somewhere else. Over the years, Benny had got used to it. Nice-looking young women drifting into his office at quiet times of the day to think past him. Not a bad thing. They cheered the place up. More so than flowers or a nice watercolour, and they generally only turned nasty if you married them. "So," he said, "these assessment things, I take it you're 110% in favour?" She looked up at him. "What? Oh yes, absolutely. I can't think of anything I'd like more than some goldfish-faced git asking me where I think I'll be in 5 years' time. Still, it does mean there's a chance we'll actually get to find out who our new masters are at last." "I was thinking that just now," Benny replied, "while I was feeding the goats. Of course, they might cheat, bringing people from outside, management consultants or whatever." "Bastards," Cassie said absently. "Management," Benny paraphrased. "At least, so far, they haven't come interfering in the actual work. You got anything new on at the moment?" A slight reaction to that, but too vague to assess properly. "One new job came in last week," she replied. "Just boring stuff." "Boring or really boring?" "Fairly boring," she sighed, but her heart wasn't in it. "When I was at Mortimer's, they let me do proper cases, really big stuff for the multinationals." Benny nodded gravely.
You never did tell me why you left.
You're right, a warning grin. I never did.
They fired you.
They did not. Cassie stood up. Well, she went on, better go and do some work, I suppose. Can you let me know when you've sorted those stupid reconciliations?
Nice girl,
Benny thought, as a door closed behind her.
Bright, too. Wasted here, of course. Not as smart as she thinks she is, mind, or she wouldn't keep getting stuck and needing Connie to go and fish her out.
He pulled a sad face. 20 years ago, he could really have made a complete and utter idiot of himself over a girl like that. Happy days. The door opened, and a small face appeared around it, a curious face in its way, which had made more than one observer think of an early attempt at head-shrinking by an apprentice Javanese headhunter. It belonged to Dennis Tanner, ex-partner and head of the Mining and Mineral Rights Department. "Go a minute," he said. Benny nodded.
"What can I do for you?"
Mr. Tanner frowned. "I need the Ibbotson file," he said, "and the expenses ledger for June 73. Oh, and the client account paying-in book as well." Benny clicked his tongue sympathetically.
"The auditors have arrived, then?"
"Too bloody right," Mr. Tanner sighed. 9 o'clock on the doorstep. Miserable suds by the look of 'em. Typical Moss Berwick. They've taken over Aunt Frale's old office, and they're demanding files right, left and centre." He shook his head sadly. "I said we should never have changed from Anderson's." Benny pulled open a filing cabinet drawer and took out a folder.
"Auditors are auditors," he said. "I often wonder what makes someone decide that's what he wants to be when he grows up. A sadistic streak and a total lack of a sense of humour, probably."
"It's the way they look at you," Mr. Tanner said. "Like you've got your fires undone and snot dribbling out your nose, and we pay them to do it too." Once Mr. Tanner had gone away, Benny glanced quickly at the botched reconciliation sheets that Cassie had left with him, observing in a detached, scholarly manner that it appeared to be an inexorable rule of nature that the prettiest girls always had the most indecipherable handwriting. He dumped them in his in-tray, made a mental note to deal with them later, so he could call her and tell her they were done 5 minutes before coffee time tomorrow.
"Hell of a job. Took me all afternoon, but I got there in the end."
Then he opened a file and ran his finger down a list headed "Things to Do" until he came to an uncrossed out entry that read "United Global Finance." He clicked his tongue. There are some jobs you keep putting off until the thought of them is enough to depress you to death. Then you eventually pull your finger out and get on with them. They turn out to be the proverbial piece of cake. He stood up, crossed the room to a tall, padlocked corner cabinet, unlocked it, and took out a long cloth bag, closed with a drawstring and a small aerosol spray can. Inside the bag was a sword, broad, curved, single-edged, deeply fullered, in a battered black leather scabbard. He drew it, tested the edge with his forefinger, sprayed a dab of oil on the blade, and worked it in with the palm of his hand. He paused for a moment to glance at the familiar inscription cut into the ornate steel hilt, a serial number, and "Property of J.W. Wells & Co. in Rooms." Benny dropped the sword back in its bag, tightened the drawstring, tucked it in under his arm, and on his way out the office flicked his desk phone to fax answer mode. At the door he paused, went back, and retrieved his umbrella. Colin was stuffing brochures into envelopes in the back office when his father sent for him.
"Got a job for you,"
Dad said, stubbing out one cigar and lighting another.
"Take the tube up to the city, 70 St Mary Axe. I've written it all down for you, and pick up some paperwork. Bring it straight back. It's urgent. Got that?"
Colin nodded. London, he thought. That'd be nice. If I play my cards right and spin it out a bit, I could stop for a burger on my way back. "Sure," he said, brightly but not too eagerly, because his father knew him well enough to be suspicious of anything resembling enthusiasm. Colin was painfully aware that he tended to overact when trying to hide an ulterior motive behind a facade of cheerful compliance. Zeal and ham pie, so to speak. "Anything else you want done while I'm up there?" Dad grinned.
"Not likely,"
he said.
"I want you back here in plenty of time to finish off these brochures."
Curses. Never mind. At least it was out of the office for an hour or so. Even reading a book on the train was a small but valuable treat compared with what he'd be doing otherwise. 70 St Mary Axe turned out to be more or less what Colin had been expecting. A bit upmarket, maybe, for the likes of H&F, but that could be explained away easily enough as a holdover from the days of the company's prosperity, when it could afford to use posh lawyers and accountants. Which of the two J.W. Wells & Co. was, he didn't know, but it was a reasonable bet it was something of the sort. Chartered actuaries, maybe. He had no idea what chartered actuaries did for a living, or just possibly stockbrokers or merchant bankers. Vultures, in any case, but since they'd afforded him an unexpected outing and possibly a chance of a quarter pounder with cheese, regular fries, large vanilla shake, he was prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt until such time as they did something nasty to him. On the way in, he nearly barged into a short, broad, bearded man with enormously thick-lensed glasses and a funny-looking cloth bag stuck under his arm. He stepped aside. The man looked so much like Mr. Magoo that Colin couldn't rely on him to avoid a collision, and let him pass before going in. A distinctly old-fashioned revolving door hustled him into a rather daunting, oak-panelled front office. He paused to take in his surroundings. "Did he get you?" said a musical voice from behind the broad, elegant reception desk. "Excuse me?" "The door." The voice belonged to a startlingly attractive blonde. Good heavens, Colin thought mildly. "It nips your ankles if you don't watch out." "No, I'm fine," he replied self-consciously. I'm Colin Hollinghead. I'm here to see..." He couldn't remember, so he dug the bit of paper his dad had given him out of his top pocket. "I'm here to see Ms. Clay." Oh, for some reason, the startlingly attractive blonde didn't seem entirely pleased. "All right, I'll let her know you're here. You'd better sit down." There was a lot of space in the front office, entirely uncluttered by chairs. "Right," Colin said. "Through there." The startlingly attractive blonde, she wasn't quite so appealing with her eyebrows ruckled together like that, nodded at a doorway in the far distance. "She won't be long." The carpet was deep and springy, like bog moss. He felt as though he was leaving a trail of footprints in it. The waiting room was small and curiously depressing. The chair Colin selected turned out to be wobbly. One false move and it would probably disintegrate under him. And the best the magazine stack on the table could offer was the Sunday Times colour supplement for 16th of April 1987. He spent the first 5 minutes of his wait flicking through it, and the remaining 4 staring aimlessly at the light fittings on the ceiling. It was still better than cramming brochures into envelopes, but the margin was tightening by the second. "Hello." He looked up and recognised her. "Sorry to have kept you waiting," she went on. "I was on the phone. I'm Cassie Clay." "Like the boxer," Colin replied before he could stop himself. Cassie's rather wan smile gave him a rough idea of how many times she'd heard that one before. "Absolutely," she said. "Now, I've got all the draft papers here, but there's a couple of points I'd just like to run over with you because they're slightly different from what I discussed with your father after the meeting." "Actually," Colin looked away, "there wouldn't be very much point, really. I'm just the messenger, you see. I don't know what all this is about." "Oh," she frowned. "In that case, if you could just let him know there are a few changes and I'll send him a letter to explain them." At that moment, if asked to put a cash value on himself, Colin would have suggested a figure somewhere between £1.50 and £1. Odd because, although he had practically a complete set of character defects, an inferiority complex was one of the few gaps in his collection. There was something about this girl, however, that made him wish he wasn't so obviously unfit for human consumption. "Right," he said. "I'll do that." She put a green folder down on the table. He waited for a second, then picked it up. That, as far as he could judge, was that. "You were at the meeting," Cassie said, and then she frowned, as if she hadn't meant to say it. That's right," Colin replied. "I got there late, as usual. Forgot about it, actually." "Oh, well, you didn't miss an awful lot." "Surreal," Colin thought. "It had probably been all over my head anyway," he heard himself say. "I'm pretty much the lowest form of life at H&F." Everyone's got to start somewhere, she replied.
That's right, he said.
He felt an unaccountable urge to tell her that, in fact, he was a managing director in disguise, just pretending to be an underachieving golfer, but he managed to repress it.
That's what Dad always says, so, he went on, have you been doing this job long?
6 months, she replied. Before that I was with Mortimer's in Fleet Street.
Oh, right.
Trying to sound suitably impressed. Feeling, who the hell were Mortimer's? He wondered idly.
Is it better here or...
Cassie shrugged. It's different, she said. Here it's more traditional. She sounded as though she was choosing her adjectives carefully. Completely wasted on him, of course. You've been clients of ours for yonks, haven't you?
I think so,
Colin replied, as he realised that his left foot had gone to sleep. All he needed, really.
Well, thanks for seeing me.
No problem.
I'll be going then,
he said, not even trying to move.
I expect you're very busy, he added.
Oh, about normal. She frowned. Are you all right? He sighed.
Pins and needles, he said, in my foot.
Oh.
I'll be all right, he said,
and shifted his weight. He managed not to scream. You'd better sit down for a bit.
Yes, well, no, actually, I can't move.
Cassie didn't laugh. Try rubbing it. He looked up sharply at her, not really knowing why.
It's getting better, actually, he said. There, I can put my weight on it. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's all right. She stopped suddenly and stared at him. Maybe 3 seconds, which can be a long time under the right circumstances. It can really hurt, can't it?
What?
Pins and needles.
It's all gone now, Colin said, exaggerating. Right, well, I'll tell Dad to expect a letter from you. Thanks again.
Oh, part of the service? Cassie opened the door for him. Through it he could see the lovely receptionist looking daggers at them both. Feeling murderously self-conscious, he crossed the front office, trying very hard not to limp. As soon as he was out on the street, the pain disappeared completely. He stopped and looked back at the door, then crossed the road. There was a pub quite close by. He lunged toward it like a sprinter clinching a world record. 2/3 of a pint later, Colin felt sufficiently composed to rally his thoughts. Something had happened in there. Something on a par with Newton's apple or Archimedes' bath. Because of it, the world was about to change. Buggered if he knew what, though. He finished his beer and got another. There was one obvious possibility, but he was fairly sure that he could cross it off the list of possibilities straight away. He'd fallen in love before. How many times? 6. Narrow the search parameters. He'd fallen in love at first sight before. Twice. Match not found. The symptoms had been different. Now, technically this wasn't first sight, since he'd seen Cassie before at the meeting. It still didn't compute. It was more something else. Déjà vu? He wasn't 100% sure what that meant, but what he understood by the term was an uncanny feeling that you're replaying something that's happened to you before. That was closer to it. But not the whole story. Not by a long way. Pause to review progress to date. Refine search. It had been the moment when he had confessed the pins and needles, and she'd said something, but he couldn't actually remember what it was, something about the pins and needles, a suggestion. That was the flashback moment. He was certain of it. That was it. She'd said, try rubbing it, and he'd been on the point of saying, you told me that the last time and it didn't work. Of course, there hadn't been a last time. They'd met before. Once. Briefly at that stupid meeting, but at that time his feet had been pinless and needle-free. More to the point, hadn't Cassie looked at him just after he'd apologised for being embarrassing? He'd seen that look in her eyes before. Somewhere. Somewhen. And at the time it had puzzled him rotten, because he couldn't understand what had been bothering her. Now, though, he did. That look on her face was what he'd have seen if at that exact moment he'd been looking into a mirror. Colin had drunk half his second pint without noticing. He put the glass down and scowled at it. This was starting to get weird, and weirdness was something that he preferred to shy away from, the way a wise dog avoids an electric fence. The second time, but I do know her from somewhere, he conceded unwillingly. Screw this, he thought. He left the rest of his beer and went outside. A bus was just pulling up, and on the front, in the list of destinations, was Fleet Street. Well, he thought, 20 minutes trudging, and he found it. A little less than 70 yards up the street from the Cheshire Cheese, a simple brass plate that read, Mortimer & Co. Mortimer's in Fleet Street, she'd said. He shrugged and went in. Just inside was a reception desk. Behind it was a girl, a singularly attractive blonde. She smiled at him and said hello. Colin closed his eyes and counted to 5. Originally, he'd intended counting to 10, but patience wasn't one of his principal virtues. You again, he said. She looked at him. Excuse me? It's you, isn't it? I saw you just now, at the other place. The smile was still there, but it was doing that thing that happened to the J537-STED3 reed valve when incorrectly installed. What was it called? Work hardening. What other place? Where I just came from. St. Mary Axe. You were behind the front desk. Slight, brittle pause. Well, no, actually, I've been here all day. No, it was you. Colin insisted. I know it was you. Or, hang on, have you got a twin sister? Me? No. She moved her left hand off the desk and was fumbling for something under the ledge, the sort of place she'd wire in a panic button. Oh, my mistake. Sorry. That's all right. Look, who is it you wanted to see? See? For a moment it was as though she was speaking a foreign language. Oh, see. No, nobody. No, I just, sort of dropped in. Well, I was passing, and I wondered if it was, what it is you do here. Just curiosity, really. The blonde girl was definitely looking past him. Chances were that the door through which the security would be likely to enter was directly behind his left shoulder. How do you mean exactly? She was saying. Colin applauded her training, or her common sense. Keep the nutsos talking and they're less likely to attack. Defending her employer's premises against the invading hordes of fruitcakes and weirdos is all in a day's work for your highly trained and motivated elite force receptionist. The thin blonde line and all that. Doesn't matter, he said, taking a few steps back. Very sorry to have bothered you. Bloody hell, is that the time? He turned and fled from the building. No more prattling about. It wasn't safe here in the big city. Only when he was safely on the district line heading for home did he feel secure enough to open his mind to what he'd just seen. Definitely the same woman. Colin could swear to that, because he never forgot a pretty face. On the other hand, it was highly improbable, verging on outright impossibility. Even if the receptionist at 70 St. Mary Axe was moonlighting or job-sharing in Fleet Street, she'd have had to take a taxi and gone like a rocket to get from one office to the other in the time his bus had taken to cross that relatively small distance. And if that was likely to happen, and it was what had happened, why on earth should she deny it? Far more likely that he'd imagined it. It'd be consistent anyhow, since he'd had quite obviously imagined having met the Cassandra Clay female before and received the benefit of her advice on what to do when pins and needles strike. For some reason, explained Colin's inner Spock, he was going through a phase of thinking that he'd recognised people when he hadn't. There could be any number of explanations for that, ranging from failing eyesight to incipient loneliness, without the need to postulate a world haunted by forgotten meetings and duplicate blondes. Served him right anyhow for playing truant from the office. As he walked from the station to the H&F Works, he noticed that the John Menzies that had moved in where Boots used to be was now a Virgin megastore, while the Monsoon 3 doors down from it had at some point turned into a Halfords. Evolution in action, he supposed. Dad was on the phone when he reached the office. He scowled and gestured for the green file, and Colin gave it to him. The scowl deepened, and Colin backed out of the room, back to stuffing brochures into envelopes then. What fun. Cassandra Clay, he thought as he worked. Fold again, lift flat, stuff, lig flat, press, take another from the pile. While his conscious mind had been on other things, the backroom boys in his subconscious hadn't been idle. They'd produced their report and were ready to discuss their findings. Not, they were pretty sure, love. The symptoms just weren't there for a start. They'd been through the files: Jackie Ibbotson, May to August 1994, Pauline Fletcher, January 1997 to April 1998, Melanie McIntosh, September 2000 to June 2002, and 16th to 21st of February 2003, and assessed the data. There were a few superficial similarities: daydreaming, wandering about bumping into things, feelings of embarrassment, self-deprecation and general despair, but the really significant features were conspicuous by their absence. True, he was having difficulties evicting her from his mind. She kept popping back like a computer virus and scrambling his train of thought. And he'd already played over the dialogue from their brief conversation 3 times, analysing it for anything that might be considered even remotely encouraging. But it didn't feel like the other times. Really. The door flew open. Not a SWAT team or customs and excise, just Dad not knocking as usual. And as usual, Colin was a 1/5 of a second too late getting his feet off the desk.
Right,
Dad said, dropping into the other chair and frowning at him.
So, what did she say?
It only took Colin a 1.5 to find the place.
Not a lot, really, he replied. She gave me the file. I brought it home with me. That's about it.
Dad's frown thickened.
Yes, but she went through it with you line by line so you could report back to me.
Colin shook his head.
She's going to write you a letter. A letter? Yes.
A sigh. Such a small sound to come out of such a large body, but it got the message across with perfect efficiency.
Fine, Dad said. She's going to write me a letter.
Colin's turn to frown, though it was a pretty feeble effort in comparison.
Well, he said, there's not much point me going through it with her when I haven't got a clue what it's all about. Wouldn't have meant anything to me. Only because you can't be asked to take an interest in the business.
Well, yes, there was that.
I thought it'd be a waste of money.
Colin offered meekly.
Right, so instead they're going to charge me £100 for writing a letter. Sorry, Colin said.
He always apologised. With all the breath he'd wasted on apologies over the past quarter century, he could have inflated a sky full of zeppelins.
So, he said, what's it all about?
Dad looked at him.
Don't worry about it, he said. You get on with doing the brochures. There'll be a memo in a day or so.
Colin smiled weakly, and Dad erupted out of the room. One of these days, Colin promised himself, I'll leave home. I'll rent a nice little cottage on the lip of Vesuvius for the peace and quiet. In the meantime, I'll go on stuffing things in envelopes and honing my esprit de l'escalier. Actually, it'd serve the old bastard right if the company did go bust, which means it won't, of course, because there's no justice. By a strange coincidence, Colin shoved the last brochure into the last envelope at exactly 29 minutes past 5. The felicity of timing made him smile, and he stood up to leave. Home, dinner, overcooked pastry and slimy green sauce. Some irresponsible clown had given Mum the latest Delia Smith for her birthday. The telly, bed. I'd get a life, and he wouldn't know what to do with it. The phone on his desk rang. He frowned. It didn't usually do that. He picked it up. "Someone from J.W. Wells for you," said Carol from the front office. She sounded as bewildered as Colin felt. "Fine," he said. "Put them through." "Mr. Hollinghead?" That voice. Yes?" Colin replied. "Cassie Clay, J.W. Wells. We met earlier." That's right," Colin said. "You gave me the documents." "Yes. She knows that, you imbecile." "Yes." Pause. "Just making sure everything was in order." She's lying, he realised. That's not why she's phoning me. "You're going to write us a letter," he said. "Yes. It'll be in tonight's post." "That's great. Thanks." "No problem." Pause. Now, Colin thought, if it was me phoning her, the motivation would be obvious. I'd be phoning her on the flimsiest of pretexts just so I could talk to her again, because I'm a pathetic loser. But she's phoning me. "So," Cassie went on, "with any luck, you should get the letter tomorrow." "Yes. And if there's anything in it that you want to talk over, please don't hesitate to call." "Thanks. I'll do that.
Or at least my dad will. I'll pass on the message.
Oh, right, that's excellent, thanks. You've been most helpful.
Not at all.
At the back of Colin's mind, a small voice conceded the possibility that it might have been wrong. He ignored it.
It wasn't me who picked up the phone and dialed a number,
he pointed out. So, she said, how's the pins and needles?
What? Oh, fine. Completely better.
Actually, that was a lie too. They'd come back, but not in his foot. Sharp, tiny pinpricks were driving into his brain, worse than any hangover he'd ever inflicted on himself. It was a bit like bee stings or really savage nettles, and it was something to do with something he'd just said, and if he'd put the phone down, it'd get better right away. On the other hand...
Sorry, he said quickly. Call for me on the other line. Thanks again. Bye.
Click, brrr, clunk, as the receiver went down in its cradle. The pain, miniature fireworks going off 1/2 inch from his temples, stopped as abruptly as it had started, so completely that he found it difficult, a second later, to remember how they'd felt. Bloody odd. Colin picked up the phone again and looked at it. Seemed harmless enough. He put it to his ear. But nothing happened, just the phone, something so mundane and ordinary that you'd never spare it a second's thought. But a moment ago, he could have sworn it was hurting him, eating his brain, like something from an OB movie. Query, what sort of monstrous life form would cross the galaxy at X times the speed of light just to eat Colin Hollinghead's brain? An alien on a diet? There must be something wrong with it, he decided. Maybe it was sending out an incredibly high-pitched squeal that he could feel but not hear. Better get the engineer in, or scrap it and get another one. Not that it mattered, because it never rang. Until today. Perplexity. And on his own time, too. But the oddness of it all was nagging at him like an abscess under a favourite tooth. He dialed a number. And waited.
Tony?
Hello, mate. I haven't heard from you in a long time. What can I do for you?
It's, all right, Colin said. I'm just ringing to see if my phone hurts my head.
That hadn't come out quite right. But he and Tony had been at school together, known each other for years and years, all through adolescence. It wasn't the weirdest thing one of them had said to the other, not by a long way.
Does it?
Tony inquired with interest.
Doesn't seem to. Keep talking.
All right, what about?
I don't know, do I? How's things?
Oh, fine. Nothing much happening. I broke up with Nikki, of course.
I'm sorry to hear that, Tony. Who the bloody hell is Nikki?
My girlfriend.
I thought that was Sarah.
Sarah? Buck at me, that's going back a bit. How long is it since you last called me, anyway?
Can't remember.
Nor me. Is it hurting yet?
Don't think so. But I was talking to someone just now, and I suddenly got this really bad headache, and I was wondering, was it just the phone or what?
I see. So, do you want me to carry on talking? I could tell you about my new MP3 player. It's got...
No, thanks. I think that'll do. How's your mum, by the way?
Oh, fine. How's your lot?
Same as usual. Right. Sorry to have bothered you.
Not the phone, then. Colin was also inclined to discount the alien theory, at least for the time being. How about a fault on the other end of the line? Something wrong with her phone? The obvious way of testing that hypothesis would be to call Cassie back, but he shied away from that. Probably best to let the whole thing go, pretend it hadn't happened. He was really good at doing that, turning a blind mind's eye to things he couldn't or didn't want to try to understand. It was, he reckoned, a skill that came with living in a house with a bloody great big tree growing right up through it. About that tree. No, this wasn't the time or the place. He'd lived with it for 25 years and had long since learned the knack of not seeing it. He'd asked about it exactly twice, once the other night and once when he was 7, the first time he'd had a little friend back for tea. The little friend had said, "Why have you got a tree growing up through the middle of your ass?" And Colin had realised that he didn't know the answer. Looking back, he realised he assumed it was perfectly normal, that everyone had trees growing up through their houses. But the little friend's reaction gave the lie to that assumption. So he'd asked Dad, who hadn't replied. Furthermore, he'd not replied with such a ferocious scowl that Colin had resolved never to raise the subject ever again, and for 18 years he'd kept to his resolution, even when he noticed, he was 8 or 9 at the time, that although the stupid thing's trunk went all the way up to the loft, he'd been up there one time with Dad to hold the torch for him while he saw to a jammed bullcock, There was nothing to be seen of it from outside the house, which was odd, even to a kid who'd still believed in Father Christmas when his classmates had already discovered tobacco, strong drink, and sex. Trees don't just stop unless someone goes out of his way to trim bits off them, and he couldn't remember ever having seen Dad coming down out of the roof with secateurs or a pruning saw, let alone bits of amputated tree. Still, it couldn't be important, could it? He'd lived with it this long, and nothing had come of it. There was probably a perfectly rational explanation that he alone was too stupid to see, and he'd only embarrassed himself by admitting his ignorance. Colin went home, dinner, telly, bed. When he was asleep, he snored. His father, quiet as a little mouse, crept up to the top landing, opened the loft lap, pulled down the folding aluminium ladder, and climbed up it. Over his shoulder was an empty sack.